Well, I've known these people now for probably 25 years. I think I met Mr. Gülen personally for the first time in 1986. And I've been in contact with the Gülen community and watched what they've been doing, their projects and their schools, and ever since then. And so I want to talk about something today that maybe is a different aspect of the Gülen community. You might have heard at various times of the thought of Fethullah Gülen in terms of the social programs and the institutions like the schools inspired by his ideas. Some people have studied his theory of education, how this is played out in the schools that they run. Others have focused on Gülen's vision as the philosophical motor behind the social movement working to produce social change, not only in Turkey or in the Islamic Ummah, but in the world as a whole. Still others have underlined Gülen's call for universal love and fellowship, and consequently his encouragement of interreligious dialogue as an essentially Islamic obligation. But today, in my paper, I want to concentrate on another aspect of the thought of Fethullah Gülen, one that I believe in the long run may prove to be the area of his greatest influence. This is his role as a spiritual director and teacher of internalized Islamic virtue. Hundreds of thousands, the number may surpass 1 million. Hundreds of thousands of Turks, Central Asians, and others, ranging from students to businessmen to young professionals, look to Fethullah Gülen as their spiritual teacher whose advice and wisdom, rooted in the Islamic tradition, has shaped their understanding of the religion of Islam and has had a formative influence on their lives as Muslims in the modern world. This acknowledgement is manifest in the honorific title by which Gülen's disciples refer to him as Hoca Efendi, that is, respected teacher. Now this aspect of the teaching and counsel of Gülen has often been referred to as the Sufi element in his thought. The question of the relationship of Gülen to the Sufi tradition has been discussed by many scholars and need be no more than noted here. According to Zeki Saritoprak, professor at John Carroll University in the United States, he says, Gülen is a Sufi in his own way. Applying a term coined by Fazlur Rahman, the late Fazlur Rahman, I have referred to Gülen in various writings, and to Sayyid Nursi before him as neo-Sufis, to describe their role as scholars who propose and explain Sufi concepts, but have not belonged to a tariqah or taken a pir. Rafat Atay, a professor in Urfa in Turkey, he has an interesting approach. He views Gülen as reviving the proto-Sufi Sufa tradition, or the Ahl Sufa, of studious piety that arose in Medina in the first centuries after the death of Muhammad. Now, Gülen himself did not begin to write about Sufism until the 1990s, when he was already 50 years old. He was more than 50 by then. His earlier sermons and writings focused mainly on Islamic elements of Islamic faith and moral prescriptions, but he often included examples from the lives and teachings of earlier Muslim mystics and ascetics. However, in 1990, Gülen began to include every month an insert into the magazine Sızıntı, or The Fountain, on which he elaborated a different concept of Sufi terminology. These were collected and became the basis for Gülen's 2-volume work called in English, Key Concepts in the Practice of Sufism. This work has also been translated, I'm told, into German, so it's available also in German if you're interested. Now, I don't intend to treat the whole gamut of spiritual advice offered by Fethullah Gülen to his disciples, but instead I'm going to focus on one central concept and try to show its role in maintaining a cohesive, Islamically motivated community life. This is the Islamic, or Quranic concept, I should say, of ikhlas, which is usually translated into English as either purity of intention or as sincerity. Both of these translations, purity of intention, sincerity, highlight an essential aspect of the Quranic notion of ikhlas. Now, in ordinary parlance, sincerity indicates what? The notion of honesty of mind, or freedom from dissimulation or hypocrisy. A sincere person is one whose external words or deeds are in accord with their inner thoughts and feelings. A sincere person does not dissimulate or pretend to be expressing one idea, while in reality his interior dispositions are to the contrary. Thus, a sincere person is not self-promoting, hypocritical, pretentious, two-faced, or devious. The sincere person neither flatters nor manipulates others. It is to this aspect of sincerity that, in our Christian Bible, Jesus exhorted his disciples when he taught his disciples to say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. And he says anything beyond that comes from the evil spirit. However, there's another aspect of the Quranic notion of ikhlas. This notion brings together the notion of purity with that of dedicating or devoting or consecrating oneself to something. Ikhlas is an interior disposition by which the faithful Muslim should perform all external acts in a spirit of service and dedicated solely towards pleasing the Divine Lord. It's noteworthy that the brief expression of the Islamic creed found in the Quran in Surah 116, and it goes, say, He, Allah, is one. Allah is He on whom all depend. He begets not, nor is begotten, and none is like Him. It's very brief. This brief surah or chapter of the Quran has been known in Islamic tradition as Surah Al-Ikhlas. In other words, surah or chapter of sincerity or chapter of pure religion. Now, the importance of ikhlas has been commented upon down through the centuries by many Muslim scholars. The The Sufi masters have been particularly fond of elaborating on this virtue, to the extent that in the minds of many Muslims, ikhlas is considered a Sufi concept. In commenting on ikhlas, Sayyid Nursi, a modern Muslim scholar who was one of the main influences on Fethullah Gülen, he repeatedly has to distinguish his own advice from that of the Sufis. While acknowledging the beneficial value of the instruction of the Sufi masters, he always says, I am not a Sufi, but these principles of theirs make a good rule for our path. Nursi's approach in this differs from that of the Sufis because he's praxis-oriented. He avoids contemplative speculation in favor of practical advice and guidance for his disciples' life together. Now, because of its roots in the Quran and in the tradition of Islamic spiritual writing, Nursi's use of ikhlas can sometimes be better translated, at least in English, as purity of intention. It's really the translation I prefer, rather than simply by sincerity. So what do we mean? Ikhlas is when someone practices all the acts of religion, solely for God's pleasure, rather than for any personal benefit that may accrue to them, whether that be prestige or pride or others' admiration. When one worships God with sincerity, one's intention is pure and undefiled by base or irrelevant motives. And as the Quran states, there is the type of person who gives his life to earn God's pleasure. And God is full of kindness to his devotees. So now turning to what Fethullah Gülen himself has to say about this concept of ikhlas. And I want to remind many of you here who are not Muslims, you like I am Christian or Jewish. I hope that as you hear this advice that Gülen is making to his students, you'll see so many of the points of spiritual contact with what we see as important in our own lives as Christians or Jews. So while interpreting the basic meaning of the term to be upright, sincere, or pure, Gülen indicates that ikhlas means pursuing nothing worldly while worshiping and obeying God. At the deepest level, sincerity can only be understood, he says, in the mystery of the relationship between God and God's faithful servant. Purity of intention is a grace or a divine gift that God places in the hearts of those whom he loves in order to increase and deepen and give eternal value to the servant's ordinary good acts. Gülen considers purity of intention to be one wing of the person's spiritual life before God, and the other is faithfulness. And together these two virtues make up the pair of wings of divine grace that God implants in the soul that enable a person to approach God directly without hindrance. He quotes Mevlana, Jalaluddin Rumi, to the effect that if good deeds were a body, purity of intention would be their soul. That is, it is a sincere intention that makes good deeds come to life, be effective, have everlasting value. Without sincerity to animate deeds spiritually, all human endeavors would remain lifeless, ephemeral, and ultimately worthless. But those who fly, he says, with the two wings of sincerity and faithfulness will travel with God's protection and will reach their destination, that is God's approval and pleasure. Gülen quotes Abu Yazid Bistami, Bayezid, to say that it is through sincere intention, not through human deeds, that a person goes to God. It's on the basis of a person's sincerity that God acts. This is important. It's on the basis of our sincerity that God judges our deeds. Not on their greatness or on the notoriety of the deed. The size and quantity of good deeds is unimportant. Even a small deed, picking somebody up at the airport, for example, pouring coffee for Congress participants. Even a small deed or one that is unknown to others, if it's done with sincerity, it's judged pleasing by God. Gülen notes that God rewards a small deed done with purity of intention more highly than many more ostentatious deeds done without that sincere desire to serve God alone. Gülen advises his disciples to maintain spiritual discretion. In practical terms, if purity of intention means that the servant does everything solely to seek God's pleasure and for no worldly motive whatsoever, it follows that sincere believers should not be ostentatious in the good deeds they perform. One seeking God's pleasure alone should hide one's good deeds from the view of others. They should remain silent about any edifying personal experiences or special treatment received from superiors or special gifts with which one has been endowed by God. Now there's much wisdom in this advice, given the universal human tendency to perform one's good deeds in order to be seen by others or to gain their approval. Moreover, human motivation is often, as we all know, complex, with the desire to serve God mixed with a craving for human admiration and approval. The sincere servant, though, recognizes that it is only God's approval, not that of others, that matters. Thus, it's unimportant whether or not one is seen to be serving God. Sincerity not only helps to keep one's intention pure, but also guards against pursuing one's goals with unworthy ends. Only purity of intention can ensure that the ends justify the means will not become an Islamic principle. Gülen explains, and there's a lot of implications to this. An Islamic goal can be achieved only through Islamic means and methods, he says. I'm quoting him. Just as it is impossible to secure God's approval without sincerity and purity of intention, so also neither can Islam be served nor Muslims directed towards their real targets through diabolic means and methods. Now, as a Christian, and reviewing Fethullah Gülen's teaching on ikhlas, I'm impressed at how similar this teaching is on the purity of intention to Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount. He says that his disciples should do their good deeds only to please and obey God. He says, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. So according to Gülen, in sincere worship, we discover that our human longing for paradise, that even that is not a sufficient motivation for doing what is right. In speaking of worship, Gülen teaches those performing acts of worship can be categorized by their intention. What's their intention? Why do we do this? By their intention, their resolution, their determination, and sincerity. He says, there's those who hope to enter paradise. There's those who hope to be rescued from hellfire. There's those who do these things because they love and want to stand in awe of God. And there's those who feel they must do these things as part of their relationship with God. The sincere worshiper, he says, no longer cares whether his deeds will form the basis for attaining paradise. That such a person performs his duties with the sole intention of loving and serving God. This is real internalization of religion. To this end, Gülen cites the 2nd century Muslim mystic, the woman mystic Rabia bint al-Adawiyya, and she said, "O Lord, I have worshipped you not because of fear of hell or out of desire for paradise. I have worshipped you because of you, because of who God is." In fact, Gülen says that sincerity should become second nature to God's servants, not a virtue after which somebody is constantly, consciously striving to attain. He says that his disciples should be so involved in worship and religious deeds, seeking God's pleasure, that that person doesn't even remember whether he should be sincere or not. In other words, even the virtue of sincerity itself must not be allowed to get in the way of the pure service of God and become the final goal of religious observance. The only true objective in the service and the performance of any good act is to serve and obey God, give God pleasure and the satisfaction that is due Him. Now, in order to do this, the disciple has to engage in self-examination and self-supervision. You know, the people in the Gülen community, they make retreats. When I tell this to Christian friends, they say, Muslims make retreats? We never heard this. These people do. They make retreats and they do it often. I've often been invited to join them. And the purpose is this. The person who has learned to be honest with oneself will be able to know whether one's motivation is solely to worship God or whether the true incentive pursued is some worldly gain such as self-satisfaction, human respect, or personal ambition. Thus, developing the habit of... And it's not only for purposes of a person's individual spiritual growth that purity of intention is a key virtue. Purity of intention has communitarian effects. There is nothing, I can tell you this, that can more quickly disrupt the proper bonds of friendship among disciples than personal ambition, competition, or rivalry. When a disciple calls attention to his superior abilities or achievements in one or another area and boasts about his relationship to his superiors, resentment and jealousy will inevitably arise. In the history of many religious communities, in various religions, has repeatedly shown that it is jealousy, judgmentalness, competition among members that are the cause of factionalism, resentment, and divisions into rival groups. Now, the virtue of sincerity, according to Gülen, can combat these tendencies in two ways. Firstly, it is sincerity that enables God's servants to keep focused on serving God alone, thus making their actions, whether great or small, equally acceptable to God. And secondly, recognizing a fellow believer's sincerity can help a person to avoid the kind of carping criticism and summary condemnation of a companion that often arises from a sense of competition. So Gülen teaches that those who seek God's blessing and strive to be true must cast no doubt on others' sincerity, but should value all servants of God as the greatest of people, I'm quoting you now, and appreciate each one as their peer. In their hearts they dissolve any harshness or bad feelings coming from others, thus showing how kindness defeats wrong. If Gülen has been successful because of the emphasis he puts on ikhlas, our purity of intention, and he cites Mevlana, Jalaluddin Rumi, to this effect. Rumi says, "You should be sincere in all your deeds, so that the majestic Lord may accept them. Sincerity is the wing of the bird of the acts of obedience. Without a wing, how can you fly to the abode of peace?" In conclusion, I can find several ways that this has had very practical effect in the Gülen community. First of all, it's united. It has not broken up into many factions and groups. I've met them in Indonesia and in Kyrgyzstan, the United States, and in Europe. They are united. Secondly, this idea of serving God by serving others. They call their community, they call their work the Hizmet, the service. You serve God by serving others. Thirdly, their willingness to do the most menial tasks. There's an act of worship involved in opening the door for somebody and running to do an errand for them, picking them up at the airport or whatever. Fourthly and finally, I find in them a real unwillingness to talk about their achievements. You have to kind of drag it out of them. They don't want to talk about it because they've done it for God. So these are some of the ideas that I wanted to share with you that I've learned from Fethullah Gülen and his community on this concept of ikhlas, or purity of intention. Thank you.